Well, friends, we're in the second week of our sermon series called Summer Reading. I hope this past week you had the opportunity to practice some unreasonable hospitality and to live in to the call to welcome others the way Christ has welcomed you. This morning, though, we're going to shift gears a little bit in week 2 as we take up a tough but timely topic, which is conflict and collaboration. You know, that kind of conflict, though, really, that gets underneath your skin. That's what we're going to be talking about. The kind of conflict that breaks families, the kind of conflict that turns friends into enemies. And then we'll look at some possible solutions for us as disciples of Jesus Christ. And we're bringing 2 books into the conversation this morning as we look at Romans 12, 17 to 21. The first is Amanda Ripley's book, High Conflict, which explores what happens when conflict becomes toxic and all-consuming. This has been a go-to read for me over the past 3 years or so. There was so much conflict going on in our denomination that I needed some place to gain some wisdom, and this book really has become that place and the playbook for understanding what was going on within me as I was in conflict and also around me as we were living in a season of conflict. The second book is Adam Kahane's Collaborating with the Enemy, which asks, how do we move forward with people that we don't like, that we don't trust, and that we don't agree with, right? Because in life, no matter what phase of life you're in, there will always be those conflicts, and there will always be those people that we struggle with because we don't understand them or we don't agree with them. So what do we do in those moments? But the heartbeat of this message really is found in Romans 12, 18, where Paul says, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And here's the hard truth, friends. It always depends on you. It always depends on you. So if you have your Bible with you this morning, go ahead and open it up to Romans chapter 12. Chapter 12 begins with Paul urging us to not just believe the truths of the gospel, but to live out those truths, to embody what we believe. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Paul then goes on through the rest of Romans 12 to show us how we can truly become those living sacrifices that are holy and pleasing to God, how we can live out that call. And he begins going through those internal changes that need to happen. But in verse 17, he shifts and he begins to talk about how we treat others. Not just the disposition of our heart, but how we treat people that we find ourselves in relationship with, especially those that we're in conflict with. So Paul says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. But let's be honest. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's our default setting, isn't it? Isn't that what the world teaches? Get them back. If someone disrespects me, I'm going to disrespect them. If someone calls me a name, I'm going to call them a name. If they take a shot at me, I'm going to take a shot at them. You punch, I will punch harder. Y'all, that's conflict. And the kind of conflict that we're talking about today, high conflict, it thrives on reciprocity. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It thrives on vengeance. But Paul is saying here in Romans chapter 12, don't play that game. In fact, step out of that cycle entirely. You don't have to live that way, and you should not live that way as a disciple of Jesus Christ. This doesn't mean stepping into weakness or giving in. In fact, what Paul's advocating for is actually spiritual courage. You see, Paul's world isn't all that different than ours with respect to relationships. People have been people since there have been people, right? And we're a messy bunch. We're a messy species living in a broken world marred by sin. The early church, it was surrounded by hostility and conflict. There were conflicts between Jews and Greeks, between Rome and the people of God, even within the church itself. If you read 1 Corinthians or Galatians, or, well, really any letter that Paul writes, you can see that there is conflict and turmoil within the body of Christ. And yet, Paul doesn't just call us to avoid retaliation. He actually encourages us to actively pursue peace. He says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. That word careful in Greek means to think ahead, to plan out peace before conflict begins. This isn't a reactive way of living. This is an intentional way that seeks peace. And that's what we want to dive into today. So let's talk about conflict. Because not all conflict is bad. There's good conflict, the kind that sharpens us, that stretches us, that challenges us, that helps us become more empathetic or compassionate or a little more understanding of others. It causes us to grow. Good conflict does. But then there's what we call high conflict. That kind of conflict that distorts us, that traps us in cycles of harm and blame, that turns disagreements into identity and differences into division, where the end goal of the conflict is not understanding or growth, it's just destruction and winning at all costs. You know, it's high conflict when people stop listening, when insults replace dialogue, and when everything becomes us versus them. This is what Paul saw in his world. I'd imagine if you look out in the world today, you see these same conflicts in our world, in every facet of life, in politics, in families, and even in the church. But there's hope, friends. There's hope. We can break these cycles when we choose curiosity over contempt. I don't know if you have watched Ted Lasso. He says, be curious and not judgmental. We can learn to ask better questions. We can learn to stay in relationship with others even if we don't agree with them. Because we can believe. In fact, we do believe that something better than the brokenness of this world and the conflict of this world is possible. That's what Paul is getting at in Romans 12. He's not saying that you won't have enemies, that you won't have conflict, that you won't have struggle or pain. He's saying, don't let your conflict, or perhaps even your enemy, turn you into an enemy. So he says in verse 18, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now that sounds nice, Paul. That sounds nice. Very pastoral, right? I'm sure that's at the bottom of like a Thomas Kincaid or some pastoral painting out there, little sheep and shrubbery or something. That sounds nice, Paul. But what if the other person doesn't want peace? What if they're difficult? What if they're toxic? What if they're just plain mean, right? Oh, you've never met any mean people, right? That are just mean to be mean. If you haven't met anyways, we're not going to go there. I've said it already, but the hard truth of Romans 12:18 is that peace always depends on you. It always depends on you. Why? Because you are a follower of Jesus. You are an agent of peace and reconciliation. You carry the Spirit of God with you so that wherever you go, God's presence is with you and God's kingdom is with you. It always depends on you. Jesus didn't just tell us to love our neighbors and the people who are like us. He told us to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. That's not passivity, friends. That's holy resistance. Holy resistance to hate, to fear, and to division. And it takes courage. But Paul's honest. It may not always be possible to live at peace, but it's always our responsibility to do our part. You can't control how others act, but you are accountable. Follower of Christ, you are accountable for how you act and react. You have agency. You get to decide how you respond to conflict and tension and people who push your buttons or wound your heart. So, what does love look like when that neighbor has hurt you? What does peace look like when maybe the relationship has become unsafe? That's where boundaries come in. Now, good fences make good neighbors isn't from the scriptures. It's not. But there's wisdom in that proverb from Robert Frost's poem, The Mending Wall. You see, boundaries aren't barriers to love and relationships. They're often the framework that makes peace possible and sustainable. Yes, God's love crosses every boundary, every line, every division that we might create. But let's face it, friends, we aren't God. And if we're going to live at peace with everyone, it's going to look different from relationship to relationship, isn't it? I mean, there are people that I can live at peace with, at that two-top in the restaurant, right, at the coffee shop, at the little table, right, where it's just two chairs. Some people, though, in order for me to live at peace with them, because living at peace is my responsibility, right? That means that, we can be in the same room, right? We'll say, hey, we'll be friendly. But to keep the relationship, there's got to be a little bit of distance. But there's some people you'll only live at peace with and be in a relationship with them, a healthy relationship, at a distance. And sometimes that's, 10 more feet. Sometimes it's 10 more miles, right? I'm not saying to build walls. I'm not saying to create boundaries for the sake of creating boundaries. Because boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They're about creating space, the margin where peace, respect, and healing can actually happen. And sometimes the most loving thing that we can do is to step back, create some space, pray deeply to the God who calls us to peace, and to trust God to do the work that you and I can't. That you and I can't do. That brings us to Kahane and collaborating with the enemy. He writes that collaboration is not about agreement. It's not about liking one another, and it's certainly not about being in control. Collaboration, he says, collaboration is about moving forward together, even when you don't know where it's going to end. Let that sink in for just a second. We often think that peace requires everyone else to change, for everyone to be on the same page, to agree. But what if real peace, what if it really only requires you to take the first step? What if it begins by us taking that first step towards someone else? Most of the time when we approach conflict, we approach it with one of three strategies. The first is this: to adapt, right? We'll just go along to get along. We'll just brush things under the rug so that we don't have to deal with that. We sort of become conflict averse. The other way that we can approach conflict is with force, right? We can impose our will. I'll make you mind. I'll make you do what I expect you to do. There's another way to deal with conflict, and that's to exit, to leave, to walk away. But if you examine the scriptures, if you look through the Bible, what you find is that the way of Jesus, it's to engage. It's not to take your proverbial ball and go home when you don't get your way. No, the way of Jesus is staying at the table. Staying at the table to love your enemy, to turn the other cheek, not because they're right, not because you agree, not because you're right, not even because you trust them, but because the way of Jesus is engagement, which means that when we're in conflict, we can't do everything, we can't fix it all, we probably can't make everything right, but we must do something. We must do something to break the cycle of pain and heartache, violence and harm. You can't do everything, but you must do something. One of the most powerful real-world examples of this concept of you must do something comes from one of the most unlikely collaborations in all of modern history, a collaboration that Adam Kahane was actually a part of and Ripley cites in her book, High Conflict. Between 1964 and 2016, the country of Colombia was torn apart by a brutal civil war between the government and the FARC, which is an armed Marxist guerrilla group. The violence lasted for more than 50 years. Over 220,000 people were killed and millions more were displaced from their homes. For nearly 5 decades, peace seemed impossible. In fact, these two sides were fighting even when they didn't know what they were fighting for, because the wounds that they carried were too deep. Their hatred was too entrenched. But in 2012, against all odds, something remarkable began to happen. The Colombian government and the leaders of FARC sat down at the same table in Havana, Cuba, to begin to have a conversation about what peace for Colombia might look like. These were men and women who had ordered kidnappings and bombings and assassinations and military strikes against one another. They didn't trust one another. They didn't like one another. They certainly didn't agree with one another, but they chose to stay in the room and to stay at the table. And Adam Kahane, who helped facilitate those conversations, he writes about the fragile progress that they made, not because anyone had a sudden change of heart or a sudden change of conviction, but because they all realized something. The alternative to working together, the alternative to collaboration was more death, more pain, more division. So they chose a different path. Not out of love, but out of determination to do what was necessary for peace. In collaborating with the enemy, he talks about some of the most powerful moments in those discussions came when both sides began to tell the truth, not just about what they had suffered and experienced, but about what they had done. The FARC commanders confessed to acts of violence. Colombian generals admitted to human rights violations, and in the midst of it, victims' families sat in the room listening, grieving, and even forgiving. Can you imagine that? Sitting across the table from someone who's committed violence against your loved ones and choosing to keep talking. That kind of collaboration doesn't feel good. It feels risky. It feels vulnerable, but it's real. It's real. And eventually, after 4 years of negotiation, a peace deal was signed in 2016. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't final, but it was progress. And it only happened because people chose to collaborate with those they once called enemies. That's what Paul's driving at when he says, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone, because peace doesn't begin with trust or agreement. Sometimes it begins with the decision to stay in the room. Paul isn't calling us to comfort. He's calling us to Christ's likeness, to keep showing up, to keep listening, to keep forgiving, even when it costs us. Because that's what Jesus did for us. That's what Jesus did for us. And Paul's command in Romans 12, it flows directly from the gospel. Jesus didn't teach peace. He embodied it. He sat at a table with his betrayers on the night of his arrest. He forgave his torturers from the cross. He blessed those who cursed him. He collaborated with the enemy, not by compromising truth or conviction, but by loving relentlessly. So Paul goes on in Romans 12 to say, do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it's written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, and Paul begins to quote Jesus, if he's hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome evil by evil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You see, what Paul's talking about is not passive peacekeeping. It's active peacemaking. That's the difference for us as disciples of Jesus Christ. We're not called to peacekeeping, we're called to peacemaking. See, the path forward is not through control or withdrawal, but through participation. Being at the table, even when it's messy, especially when it's messy. So I want to invite you this morning to think about your world. Who is your enemy right now? Who's the person that you've written off as unreachable, unworthy, or unforgivable? Who's that person that you've not only put up a boundary, but you've built a wall of separation? Who's that person? I want to challenge you this week. Don't wait for them to make the first move. Don't wait for them to make the first move. Don't wait for things to get better or for a few more days to pass. Because as far as it depends on you, you're called to live at peace. So you be the one who listens. You be the one who forgives. You be the one who walks across the line, not because it's easy, but because it's what Jesus did for you. It's what Jesus did for you. Romans 5:8 puts it plainly, that while we were yet sinners, while we were still enemies of God, in conflict, Christ died for us. Christ died for us. And if he did that for us, what might we do for all of them? How might we take the first step toward rebuilding relationships, toward getting out of cycles of violence and pain? How might we take the first step toward building God's kingdom in our homes, in our communities, and in the world? You're called to be a peacemaker. So may we make peace.